Okay, I have gotten myself into this by suggesting this topic all by myself. Does matter matter? Now, so I want to start with a little bit of background about why I chose this topic and where I'm coming from in speaking about it. So, who am I and why this topic? That's the thing. Now, once upon a time, I was a very normal person. I grew up in a very normal Catholic rural setting with my very functional family, a kind of normal, conservative, very safe and protected environment, and I thought that was pretty normal at the time. Nothing unusual there. Okay, so then I grew up and went to university, where I studied maths and computer science and did quite well at it, and filled in my spare time with joining an assortment of different Christian groups and going to dancing lessons. So after I graduated, I got a job working with homeless teenagers and disadvantaged youth, and part-time job. And I also went on trips, a few short-term mission trips to India in my spare time. So that's me, that's Christmas 1987 with my friends in Lucknow, who I happen to live down the road from again the last couple of years. So there we go. And then, so after several years of doing different kinds of youth work and stuff, I finally met the handsome fellow over there and got married. There we are, 23 years ago. So it was a really good party. Sorry that you missed it, but there you go. So then 2 years after we got married, we moved to India. So there we are in the first room we lived in 1995 when we first arrived in India. So most of the time, in the last 20 years, we've lived in one room in a Muslim slum in North India. So I've got a few photos of that, so you get a little bit of a snapshot of my life and therefore sort of what is informing my ideas about the world. So this was the smallest room we ever lived in a little slum called Barapur. That's our elder son Tom when he was about 3. And that room was 7 foot by 9 foot and had a not very strong roof. Okay. But that slum got demolished and all the people were moved 27 kilometres from there. So then we moved to another part of town. We had another kid, lived in another small room, collecting some photos you can see. And then the next one. So that's then the suburb that we lived in for 9 years. That's the longest I've lived in one place in my whole life. You can see our room there, but it's not very obvious. If you can see in the foreground that piece of black plastic there, that's the roof of a friend of ours. You'll see a photo of her later on. So we lived there for about 9 years, and then a few years ago we moved to another city called Lucknow. So that's kind of my history. So where I'm coming from in talking about does matter matter, it's not all about books or theology or anything else it's more about my own experience in life and my reflections on that. So there's probably lots of stuff you could argue with or have a different view, but if my view seems not very normal, that is why. Okay, so now you understand. Okay, so I feel like in all of that, I've basically made the decisions that seemed sensible to me at the time, given my faith in Jesus and looking at the world, it all just seemed the sensible next thing to do. Somehow it seems to be unusual, though. I don't find many people who have done this thing. Okay, is that better? Yeah, okay. I think I'm moving around a bit much too. Sorry, stand still. Is that better? Okay, that's good, that's good. Okay, so then, so the simple answer to my question, does matter matter? Yes, of course matter matters. When you give it a briefest of thought, we're all human beings and we rely on food and water and air, like the material world is what sustains our life. When you think a bit more from a Christian perspective, we believe that God created the whole material universe, and if we assume that he just wasn't just on a whim and making a piece of junk, then it's all important stuff, basically. And mostly as Christians, most people would feel like we are more like guests and caretakers of the earth rather than its masters. So I think our attitude to the material world is really important. Obviously, matter is crucially important to our survival, and our attitude to it is also really important. So then the question is not so much does matter matter, I just asked that to get you here. The question really is, how much does it matter? How do we weigh it up compared to spiritual, emotional, relational kind of issues? Maybe God created the world and he's kind of fond of it, but what really matters is our eternal destiny. What's most important is other stuff, and that this is more like the stage on which the play of everything important happens, and it's just like props rather than very important. Maybe, and I'm sure a lot of people have that kind of attitude. And then if we want to think about how much does matter, then do different things matter more and others matter less? What about inanimate objects, and what about plants, and what about animals? How do we weigh those issues up? And then if you think about people, well, how much do the people in this room or the people who I know matter compared to the people who I don't know but I hear about on the news, or future generations? So there's all sorts of complexities of how we weigh up how much different things matter. It seems to me that within Christianity, through history, the little bit of history I've read about, and also even today in my own life, there is often quite a bit of angst over this question. What matters more, the material world or the spiritual reality? What is it more about, so the social justice people versus the evangelical people, or the private spirituality versus the get out there and change the world kind of people? So, and that is often kind of in competition. So, and we can see where that kind of competition comes from. There's kind of good basis for it if you take a cursory glance at what's in the Bible. So I've got a series of slides here showing a few different references with the matter doesn't matter so much and other things are more important kind of quote is on the left, and the actually material things matter to us is on the right. So you see that Jesus said, man does not live by bread alone. On the other hand, he fed great crowds of people bread when they were hungry. So it obviously matters. Okay, next one. And don't worry about what you're going to eat or drink or what you're going to wear. But on the other hand, in 1 John, and there's a very similar passage in James, if you see your brother in need and don't meet those needs, well, how can the love of God be in you? So how we respond to physical needs is a very important thing. If this is really intriguing, we won't go into the interpretation of if your right eye causes you to sin. But so the left-hand verse there is talking about, discarding body parts if they're causing you sin. So it's putting a lower value on your physical well-being than on something else is more important than that. Whereas there's so many stories of Jesus caring about people's physical well-being, of healing the blind and the sick and the cripples and raising people from the dead. So he obviously cared about people's physical well-being. Yep. This is one of my all-time great stories, Martha and Mary. I am Martha ever through. But Jesus holds up Mary's way. No, don't worry so much about all those practical things. Mary has chosen a good thing to be sitting here and listening. But then on the other hand, in Jesus' interaction with Zacchaeus, the tax collector, what Zacchaeus was going to do with his money seemed like the crucial turning point in his life, like the practical outworking of his encounter with Jesus seemed to be the important part. Next one. And don't be afraid of those who could kill the body and can't kill the soul. So that's talking more about, there are more important things than your body. But then when you look in Matthew 25, it talks about the whole final judgment in terms of how you have treated the least, whether you fed the hungry and clothed the naked and so forth. So I guess either side of this big tense argument can prove their point from Scripture, or I'm sure they could use all manner of other arguments too. So there's lots of fodder in there, lots of material that we can use to prop up different arguments. And as I was thinking about this more, I thought often it's like a tug of war, and the people who pull the strongest win, or the people who argue the best win. And so it feels a bit like the global church is in this perpetual tug of war, trying to work out who's going to win this, who's got the right side of the debate. If we're a little bit more balanced than that, we might have more of a picture of it as a balancing act, and we try to hold together and hold in balance these different things. But still, as I was reflecting on this, do I like this image of how I hold together matter and spiritual things? I don't really, because it feels like if I've got a fixed amount of stuff, anything more that I put here is less here, or they're somehow still on opposite sides from each other, and and kind of competing or weighing against each other in some way. And I thought the more and more I try to put into it, if I try to think 50-50 isn't good enough, I need both and I need to hold it together, they're both equally important, then I end up trying to lift something that's way too heavy, like that I've got 100% on both ends of the barbells and it's just not working for me. And I probably did that when I was 20 and I was probably good at it then, but I don't think I can do that anymore or for the rest of my life. I need to find a better way to hold these things together and acknowledge their importance without it just being hard work or too ridiculous. So then the image that I came up with was that it's more like both things are working as a team. So, this is the India connection. I've seen these things in action. Carts pulled by 2 bullocks or ploughs pulled by 2 bullocks, or whatever. And you don't have the bullocks going in opposite directions. If you have one is too strong and the other is too weak, you'll go round in circles. You want 2 well-matched bullocks pulling your thing forward in the same direction. And I thought, for me, that's a much better illustration, and that our attitude to spiritual stuff and to material stuff, or how we work in those things, they need to be working together as a team, pulling us in the same direction. That the kingdom of God is maybe a team of many bullocks all pulling in the same direction rather than a massive tug of war all pulling in different directions. But so teamwork, maybe a 2-man saw or a 2-bullock cart or something, seemed to me a much better vision for holism, for how we hold these things together. So for me, that's one of my gains out of doing this talk today, because I've often thought about holding things in balance, and when I was thinking about it a couple of weeks ago, I thought, no, I don't like that anymore, actually. So this is my new picture of how I do this. My new picture of holism is the 2-bullock cart. It's no longer balancing things on a scale or lifting a heavy barbell. It's now pull 2 bullocks on the cart. Anyway, so if you like it, take it home. Otherwise, feel free to think up. If you come up with a better vision for holism, let me know. So I think holism then, for me, is a very important thing that I'm always still trying to work out. How do we live this? How do we hold together these things? Because as human beings, we all have a spiritual side and a body physical side, and it's not as if we can separate that stuff in ourselves and say, here's my spirit and here's my body. They're very intertwined. It's like different dimensions of my being rather than different parts. It's not like here's an arm and here's a leg. It's more like different dimensions of my being. So somehow holding it together in a way that has congruence and isn't detracting from each other or in competition with each other is really important. So another possible picture for that is maybe 2 sides of a coin, things that can't be separated. So go on to the next one. So, is that going to work? Oh, it's not working. That was an animated graphic and the coin was flipping over before, but anyway, there you go. Okay. So I think holism is about knowing ourselves as body, soul and spirit, and those not being separate compartments but kind of more like differing dimensions of us as people, and therefore of how we treat other people and therefore of how we live out our lives. But I don't think that means that everybody has to do everything all of the time. There's still, of course, room for us to specialise. So I might spend 20 years living in a slum in India, and you might spend 20 years, working in a school or working in a laboratory or, doing something else altogether. So I don't think it's important that everybody does everything, but I think it is really important that we don't think my thing is the only right thing and look at those terrible people doing that thing or whatever. So much more a sense of the teamwork and of working together, and that in the wholeness of variation is the kingdom of God. So there's definitely room for specialisation, and there's definitely room for seasons. What I do now might not be what I do in 5 years' time. The world is changing and so am I, and how we respond to that will change. And room for context, like what I do here is different from what I do in India, because you're responding to a different set of circumstances. Okay, so that's kind of my theory of holism and does matter. And the rest of what I want to say is more to do with some observations I've made. So we've been in Australia for a bit over a year now, after being in India for most of the 19 years before that. So I've kind of got a few observations, and again, you might think they're off target because I just don't see the whole picture, because I certainly don't see the whole picture of Australia. But my first one is most of us live as though my matter matters most, basically. It's like, and it's kind of a very natural human condition, I think. We're very self-focused as a natural kind of a thing, and getting beyond that requires constant, effort or, noticing and doing things differently. So basically we're way too concerned about our own material well-being and comfort and security and all that sort of thing. So in Australia, the things that have stood out to us in the last year, first of all, house size. So we've gotten very accustomed to living in something about 4 metres by 4 metres, and that seems like quite an adequate space for a family of 4. If you add on a bit of space here and there. So it's hard to see because the screen's a bit small, but in the top diagram, that's how big the actual average house size is, and the different squares represent different countries. And Australia is the largest size square in the middle, like the centre block, and the other ones are all different countries. So Asian countries like Hong Kong and Taiwan are the smaller yellow squares, and the big Western countries are the big red boxes on the outside. The bottom graph shows it as a per capita floor size, and Australia wins. Why are we not surprised? So the average amount of residential floor space per Australian is about the biggest in the world. Not too far different from USA and Canada, but yeah, we're right up there. So it's astounding to us. And I guess most Australians don't really notice it because that's all you see wherever you go. But to us, it's just quite astounding. Out of the Australian Bureau of Statistics, some stuff I was looking up said that, so this is from a couple of years ago, but the average floor area of newly built homes has increased almost 50% over the last 30 years. We're building houses bigger and bigger while the household size is diminishing and diminishing. So it seems all crazy. Anyway, the other areas that we've looked at, some statistics and so forth, is the consumption of meat, alcohol and tobacco in Australia. And this is quite incredible to me. The average Australian consumes 111 kilograms of meat in a year. It's a lot. And it's more than twice the world average. And our consumption of things like cigarettes and alcohol, it's astounding to me. If these are the averages for the country, then we're certainly not contributing to them. I don't know how much you are all contributing to them, but someone out there is drinking a lot and smoking a lot and eating a lot of meat. So I guess in terms of consumption of the world's resources, we are over-consumers, basically, is the point. Okay, so my second observation is that most of us live with a disturbing disregard for other people's matter, for their material well-being of other people in the world, and whether that's other people just down the street or the people we hear about on the news. We're just disturbingly unconcerned about it. And maybe I'm just cynical, but it seems to me that the aid budget keeps decreasing, and the budget for dealing with asylum seekers is mainly spent on keeping people out. So it's just like, well, we don't care about other people, or whatever words we put on about caring about other people seem to be covering up a different agenda. So, for example, in the Australian aid budget, there have been more cuts again this year. So this is a poverty analysis, some organisations' analysis of the aid budget, and the blue bars show what has been promised that we will give, and the red bars show what is in this year's budget. And that's split up over different regions. Can you read what the regions are, Marcus? Pacific on the left?
East Asia, South Asia, Africa and the Middle East, and then Latin America and the Caribbean.
Yeah, so we're still giving about 60% of what we promised in the Pacific, and that's because those are the countries where we have a deal with them processing asylum seekers for us, so we're feeling a bit more obliged to continue to give them money. Everybody else is suffering massive cuts. And it's quite... Anyway, I was thinking I was just being cynical, but then when I looked up some stuff on the web, I found this quote directly from Joe Hockey on the 15th of December, the Treasurer fellow. He said that savings of $3.7 billion in the foreign aid program, savings of $3.7 billion, that means what we're not giving in aid, over the next 4 years would offset new commitments in defence and national security. So we're taking away from the aid budget in order to increase defence and national security. And so it's now fallen to less than half of what had been promised, which was to reach 0.5% of the gross national income by this year. So we've broken the promises to even get to 0.5%. We're giving less than half of that. So it's pretty hard to paint that in terms that says Australia is a generous nation that cares about other people. Yeah, okay. The next one. Another area for us that just seems where Australia is a bit ridiculously uncaring about other people in the world at the moment and future generations is the whole area of carbon emissions. So this is global carbon emissions since 1980, carbon dioxide emissions. So the greyish line in the middle is the world average. The pink line at the bottom is India. So it's really increasing lately, but it hasn't really quite made it up there. So the yellow line is China. It is really increasing at a massive rate with the development there. And the top line up the top is USA. Australia's line isn't on this graph. We're not significant enough in the global, scene to make it onto their graph, but we're actually above the USA. So we have some of the highest carbon emissions in the world at like 3 or 4 times the global average. Now we're being accused of we're not taking it seriously enough. Well, I think there's probably some fair basis for other countries to accuse us of not taking it seriously enough. Anyway, there you go. So these things really are very stark to us. Okay, so the next, my observation. So this is my observations of Australia. We care too much about our own matter. We don't care enough about other people's matter. It seems to me we have basically turned the economy into an idol, that most of us trust more in the economy than in God. That I guess we're, in some ways it's very understandable. Like living here, I can feel that pull when I go to the big mall and there's all these signs up or whatever, and I listen to the news every morning about how the economy's doing, whatever. So I can feel all that stuff that's out there in society telling us this is what's really important, this is what's going to save us. Economic growth is the crucial issue. But I don't believe it. So I think we're very stuck on that, and it keeps getting fed to us over and over again that the economy is the most important thing. I haven't queued it up. Sorry. Yep. I think we've got time. We've got a 4-minute video clip about global wealth, so I think that's a whole lot better than my words. So I'll just find it. So he's done a lot of research on UN websites and so forth and thinks, yeah, things stink in the US, but actually on the global scale it's worse. If you took all the global wealth of the world, this is the population divided into 20% bands, and then if you resize them according to how much of the wealth of the planet they own, that's what it looks like, basically. So the top 20% own is that 94% of the world's wealth. The video is actually about 3 years out of date. So the richest 1% now owns 48% of the wealth, 2% old figures. Yeah, so we'll watch this bit too. So he's lined it up, divided the world into 100 people from the poorest to the richest, and then look at how much wealth that they each have and where it's distributed. So of the total net worth of the world, you put it on a graph and that's what they have, basically. So the poorest have a very small percentage. And if you zip over to the right-hand side, they have a massive amount going off. So there, the richest 1% have 43%. Well, it's now up past 48%. It's almost there. Anyway, yeah. So I think we'll just pause that since we can't get the sound out. But they did a very neat job of organising it into graphics, and they also showed how the aid budget is very small compared to the money that drains in the opposite direction by various means. So it's quite a damning little video. Can you work out how to stop it and go back to the show? Or should I come over? Very good. Yep. That'll do this. Well done. Thank you. Okay, sorry about that. Good little video. Yeah, so the wealth distribution around the world is really disturbing. And while we're not part of, I don't think anyone here in this room is part of that super rich 1%. As a nation, Australia generally has a lot more resources. We're further along the scale than a lot of other people. And it's very poorly distributed. So another area in which I feel like, oh yeah, go to the next one. Yeah, so that was the graphic off of the video. And then, yeah, I just looked at the news this morning and there was this thing about how companies are chasing dividends to try to attract business now, but actually that's going to mean it's going to spoil their future economic growth. So it just seems like this is what news is about. It's about the economy and economic growth. When we were listening to the news every day before the election, it seemed like there was so much stuff about economic growth, basically. And when people are talking about jobs and the importance of jobs, I didn't ever get the impression that they meant they're concerned for the well-being of families and for people to be employed in something that's meaningful and constructive. They were thinking, we need jobs to keep the economy going. It reminds me very much of, Jesus talking about, was man made for the Sabbath or the Sabbath made for man? And very much I get the feeling man is made for the economy these days, and we are all here to keep the economy chugging along. Next one. Okay, so the last of my observations is that basically because of all of this stuff, our spiritual life in Australia is terribly compromised. I think if we, look at some of the other Bible verses I didn't put up there before, basically Jesus talks a lot about the dangers of wealth. How can the rich enter the kingdom of God? It's harder than getting a camel through the eye of a needle. You can't serve two masters, money and God. So there's lots of stuff where Jesus quite directly condemns wealth as a big danger. When you think of the parable of the sower, now I've got that here somewhere, the seeds that landed amongst the thorns were choked by the worries of this world and bore no fruit at all, bore no yield. It was in there somewhere. Anyway, yeah, so I think basically our spiritual life is badly compromised because we are so caught up in the material world in the wrong way. So while the material world is vitally important, it seems like we're caught up too much in our own matter and care too little about other people's matter, and that's really compromising us in terms of our spiritual life. Okay, next one. So one of our friends was talking recently, and he thinks that we're addicted to consumption. He was seeing kind of addictive sort of behaviours of people needing to buy more stuff and get more stuff and consume more stuff. And I'm thinking, oh, that's interesting. I'm thinking of it as idolatry, and he's thinking of it as an addiction problem. What does it take to detox from this addiction problem? We've experienced, like living in India for all this time, living with people who are very much poorer in material ways. It's been a very effective detox for us. There's a whole lot of things that used to bother us that just don't bother us anymore, or that used to somehow seem important and that just doesn't anymore. We just have a different perspective on things. So if you have a spare 5 years, I think 5 years would be enough. If you have a spare 5 years, I'd really recommend to go live in a slum in Asia, or relocate to a poor and needy neighbourhood in Australia and just get a different perspective on the stuff that you own. It is very freeing. Actually, the next slide, I think the other thing is freedom. Like, it is very freeing to be able to not care about your house too much because there isn't much in there that would be worth having. And if somebody else had it, they probably needed it more than you. So we found this whole thing very freeing. So I've mentioned two people there. A young guy we've met here called Andy Payne. He did an experiment of living with no money for a year. And so he did all sorts of creative things in order to do that. Maybe you should get him in to speak sometime on how to live with no money. He'd be great. But one of the things he reported that he really enjoyed was the freedom of not needing to worry about that stuff. He found creative ways to get by and to contribute to society and receive things in kind without having to deal with money, and to take up some of the slack of all the waste in our society. He managed to live quite well off of the waste that he managed to find. Anyway, the other person there I've mentioned is Cathy. Now, she's the person who lives in that black plastic roofed hut that I pointed out in an earlier photo. So this is her with 3 of her kids and a ring-in. So we met her quite a number of years ago, and soon after we met her, her baby died, and then a couple of months after that her husband died. And she was a very poor, illiterate widow with a little bit of a disability who lives in a dirt floor hut just in front of our house, so you can't ignore it. Like, we lived in the nicer, slightly bigger house, and she was just right before our eyes, basically. We couldn't hang out our washing without knowing that there is Cathy in her hut. So her kids were having, one of her kids in particular was having a skin disease, like different rashes and stuff, because they were sleeping on the dirt floor of their hut. So when we asked in what way could we help her at all, we spent a lot of time helping to get her the widow's pension, which has made a significant difference to her. But we also did a simple practical thing and went out and bought a bed, a very simple wooden bed, 4 legs and a platform thing for her and her kids to sleep on. And I think we might have bought her a plastic bucket too. Like, she asked for 2 things. We went to the bazaar, brought them back to her and said, "Is there anything else you need, Cathy?" And she said, "No, that's all I need. I'm okay now." So we were touched and flabbergasted by the fact that this woman had so little and had gone through such loss, but was grateful and happy and content with what she had. A real lesson to us, and we can, go home to our comfortable beds and everything else. But so I think there is a real freedom in having less stuff and not being caught up in the need to have more stuff. Okay. Next one. So what can we do? How can we be different? I think, for me, the first thing to do is to really treasure our material world. Matter does matter, and the ways in which we can treasure it, these are just my suggestions, maybe you have better ones. Enjoy it. Enjoy nature. Do more low-tech stuff that gets you out in the natural material world. Some nice low-tech outdoor recreations and holidays. Learn to enjoy and appreciate stuff. Mark's really got into trees the last couple of years. He wanders around thinking, I wonder what that tree is, and finds out and, recognises trees. It's just a new appreciation for the natural things around us. I think also if we use less stuff, we value what we have more. If you're not always buying more new things, you tend to appreciate more the things that you have. So I think use less and value it more is a pretty good attitude to take, or an experiment to try. Use less stuff and value what you've got more. And I think we need to repent of our sins of destruction, basically. We're really exploiting the natural environment as though we own it and as though it's expendable and infinite, and we can't continue to run economic growth forever on a finite planet. and we can't continue to have any... I mean, as long as the wealth inequality is as bad as it is, there will continue to be lots of strife and conflict around the world. So we've really got some heavy-duty sin to repent of. And by repent, I don't mean say a nice prayer and say you're sorry. I mean turn around and do life differently. We really need to change how we do life that takes into consideration the importance not only of the material stuff I possess, but of the material needs of other people on the planet, and the fact that the planet isn't ours just to dispose of. We can't just do what we want and chuck it in the bin. Okay, so treasure our material world. The second thing, I think, is that we need to do more of looking out for others' needs. And I think, first of all, it's really important to see that as not being your own generosity, but as something for your own benefit. If wealth is really as dangerous as Jesus is saying, if we are critically compromising our position in the kingdom of heaven by being wealthy, well, heavens, let's do something about it. Let's get rid of it. So I think it's a really good idea to be less wealthy and to do things in your life that help you be less enthralled by the need for material possessions and security. To basically look at those global statistics about the consumption of the limited resources of the planet and try to use our fair share. Try to make sure the people who are missing out get a little bit more. Love your global neighbour. I mean, I guess love your local neighbour too. There's sure to be someone in your street that needs stuff more than you do. But on the global scale, things are grim and we need to live our lives in accordance with that reality. I think it's a kind of, in some ways, an unfortunate corollary of our globalised world where we have all the information about what's happening out there and it's a bit of overload, but we are then responsible to do something with that information and to live differently as a result. Next one. What can we do? Oh. Doesn't want to move. You obviously have to think about that one some more. Okay. Trust God, not money. So, same kind of stuff, really. Don't let economy be God for you. We've been surprised, I mean, it must be because we're getting older, but we've been surprised at how many of our friends and relatives are really seriously discussing working a few more years to get their superannuation a bit higher because they're going to need that. And I'm thinking, oh, gosh, maybe we should think about that. No, maybe we shouldn't think about that. Should I think about that? But the system here is stacked against you. The system here tries to make you trust in the economy and trust in your own independence and build up your own wealth. But really, God is asking us to live differently than that. So I think I don't think I have the answers for how you should do that in Australia, but I think it's a really important question to be asking and to think about. How can I be less dependent on money and how can I live in a way that actually trusts God, not money? For us, that's brought home to us again and again in India, where people around us trust God through lack of choice. They don't have the money to pay for this surgery or this doctor or this thing that they need, and they're kind of forced to trust God. Whereas we have the money, so we go to the doctor. But, what are the ways in which we can trust God more? My suggestions are, find ways that you can live out the fact that the economy is not your saviour. Work part-time is a great idea. If you can at all manage to do it, work part-time so that you have more time to pray, to do the gardening, to, help your neighbour, get involved in political issues, whatever, to give more of your time and presence to other people. If you work part-time, you have more time to cook your own dinner or, whatever, do your own stuff and consume less. Working part-time, earn less, consume less, it all makes a lot of sense and seems to me a much more sustainable kind of a life, more kingdom-oriented life. And give of your time and presence to others, not just give them your wealth too, but more than that, give them your time and presence as well. That's it. I thought I had one more point, but that is obviously it. So I think then the short answer to does matter is yes, it matters crucially. Next one. That the material world is not in opposition to or in competition with our spiritual life. And it's not irrelevant or unrelated or separate. So it's neither in competition and nor is it irrelevant and separate. But they're inseparably part of the whole of what the kingdom of God is about, the material world and how we respond to it, as well as spiritual, emotional, social kind of issues, whatever, all that stuff. It's an integrated whole. How we live with matter is crucial, I think. So that's all I've got to say.
Thanks.
Feel free to ask questions.
We might do some questions. It's really good to be reminded that our normal isn't everybody's normal.
Yeah.
And so what you said about perspective, I think, is really important. It's a reality check, actually, to hear from you. So we will do some questions. Can we just be mindful of a couple of things? Cathy first.
Yes.
Because Theo's recording for us, if you could repeat the question.
Okay, yep.
Audience and participants, Cathy has to repeat the question. So if we keep it short and succinct, be mindful of time and of the need for Cathy to be able to kind of repeat it and process it quickly. Great, thank you.
Thank you, go for it. That's it, that was easy then. Yes.
Cathy,
Matt.
what would your takeaway message be for non-Christians? If you were making the same sort of arguments that you made tonight, you made arguments that would appeal to a Christian, labelling various entitlements as idolatrous, and you've also made lots of civic and political points that we as citizens who are not Christians, those who are citizens but not Christians, might like to sit up and take notice of.
Yep. Okay, so basic question is, how would I argue a similar thing to a secular audience? Yes. Okay, well, Mark in the last year has taken upon himself to read books and he tells me little bits about them. So I would say there's lots of stuff out there in social science that would back up the same kind of conclusions. So one book that he read was called The Happiness Hypothesis, and it basically surveyed a lot of people and did a lot of research and said that the happiness curve related to money goes something like this. Really poor people aren't very happy. People who have a bit of money, bit more, you get happier and happier, but as you get more and more after that, it goes down and down and down. People with more money are not happier. There is a peak to the curve way lower than the average wealth of the Australian, where people are happy. They have their basic needs met, but they're not, overly caught up in all that. So I think there's good social research out there to say wealth is not what makes you happy. If happiness is what you want in the world, don't go for wealth. Go for meeting your basic needs, work part-time and then do something fun. So that was one good book, a book that, was a secular-based, research-based thing. The other thing was, I think it was called The Tipping Bell. No, what was it called? Tipping Point? There was a book about tipping point? Yeah, I think so. And it was all about inequality, and it related income inequality and wealth inequality to a whole lot of social ills, basically. The more unequal the country is, the more murders there are. The more unequal the country is, the more, there was a whole lot of socially undesirable features that were correlated quite strongly with inequality. So, that kind of set of social research says share the wealth is a good idea. It helps make a more, a better society, a safer society with fewer murders. What was the book that you read about inequality? The Spirit Level. Spirit Level. Okay. So I don't know, what else to quote at, but I think there is a lot of more social science research out there. Some of the Jared Diamond stuff maybe about the rise and fall of civilisations and what causes civilisations to crumble. There'd be lots of stuff out there, other kinds of arguments to back up a similar thing about if we lived a bit more in moderation and consideration, the whole world would go better.
Cathy, I suppose to say that we live in an information age doesn't mean saying.
Yes.
And we are so acutely aware of issues such as global warming, violence, poverty, vegetable growth, just poor things. There are tons and tons of others. We live in an information-rich age, and yet it appears to be inversely proportional to the amount of energy, effort, and financial sacrifice that we are making as individuals and particularly as a nation.
Yeah.
Why is that? We're getting more information and less effort.
Ask God. So the question is, we got more and more information about all these problems out there, but it seems that there is less and less response in terms of people's putting action there or giving donations or whatever to actually do something about these issues. I don't know. I think there's something to do with this whole idolatry of the economy thing that the Western world has bought into big time, that market economy and global capitalism is the way to go. That requires ongoing economic growth, and this is what we have to do. This is what makes the world go round. So I think in a lot of ways we've bought into that stuff big time. I remember when Jubilee 2000 was happening and there was all this campaign work to try to wipe the debts of the most indebted developing countries. Hearing a quote from a radio call-in show in the United States, which the caller was saying, "But I just don't see how this is in our national interests." And that's basically it. Well, it's not supposed to be in our national interest. It's supposed to be in somebody else's national interest, isn't it? Although, when you think about 9/11, you think, well, maybe it would have been in your national interest to be a bit more generous to other countries and listen to them a bit more. I don't know. That's a really good question of the times. I have one suggestion too, and then I'll hear your suggestion because it's probably better than mine. But I was thinking about this the other day in terms of climate change, and I was thinking, the problem is who is affected by climate change at the moment, right now. So it's not yet so bad that Brisbane is being evacuated because of rise of sea levels, or we haven't had such horrendous weather that everybody's standing up and saying, we really need to do something. So at the moment there's a small, of the whole population, there's a small section that is currently being real live affected by this, and they're not making our news very much. And then there's a small section of people whose lives are kind of in control enough that they're looking out there and thinking about what are big issues in the world that I should be doing something about. Climate change is my thing. I'm really going to fight this because I think this is a really big issue we need to do. And then there's this vast majority in the middle whose lives are complex and full of other things, and they're self-focused and whatever, and they're not personally affected and they don't personally care enough to do something, and that's just the biggest majority So I wonder how big does the calamity have to be before suddenly people decide, this might affect me, I should do something. What was your take, Marcus? Do you want to... Yep, or tell me quick.
My understanding is that more information doesn't do it for us. What does it for us, what brings us to action, is if we meet somebody who is struggling. So we hear all the stats about refugees and we don't do anything. But if we actually go out to the detention centre and meet someone, it makes a difference. If we hear all the stats about poverty, but if we don't know anybody who's poor, we don't do anything. If we meet someone, I think that's what's made a difference for us is we know Kanish, she's a friend of ours, or I know an Indigenous friend, I know a Muslim friend, I know a refugee. That's what brings me to action. The stats, we've just had so many stats for so many years, it doesn't do anything for us. That's my sense of it.
Yep, that's true, good point. It makes a lot of difference to my attitude to superannuation, calling Kanish a friend. If she was a statistic, then of course I could go and build up my superannuation and plan for my retirement, but that's someone who, if I want to have any integrity calling that woman a friend, then how can I do that, How can I do that? Good point.
Cathy, sure, a year back from your life in India to Australia, some of the ideals that you've brought with you are kind of crashing up against the reality of living here. So I'm interested in what compromises have you kind of been prepared to make so far?
Yes.
What are the ones where you're like, I'm going to keep being here?
Yes. Yep. Compromises we always feel very obliged to make is to go to family birthday celebrations held at expensive locations, which only have 2 vegetarian things on the menu that you don't like very much, but you go anyway. Yes. I guess we make a lot of compromises around those kind of things, around relationships. I had a very wise friend in India once who came and lived in our slum suburb, so an educated middle-class Indian woman who came and lived in our suburb for a couple of months and had to really She had to go buy a new wardrobe because she lives in the middle class part where you could wear jeans and, short tops or whatever. She had to buy a new wardrobe and work stuff out. And so she was really reflecting on clothing and what does it mean, because it didn't feel like her at all. And she decided that the important thing about clothing is that it should not cause an obstacle to the relationship. So she'd wear anything that was vaguely comfortable and fitted, and it shouldn't be an obstacle to the relationship. So for me, that's become a very helpful guide for what things do we compromise on here. It's like, okay, so how can I be with this person that won't cause an obstacle for the relationship? Although then you sort of balance that with, so how much is this person willing to engage with this issue? If I just be a little bit more honest here and push it a little bit, might that get somewhere, or is it just silly? Yeah. So I've learned a few things the hard way about what kind of conversation to make at those expensive location birthday parties, and I've crossed a few things off my list that I should not make in small talk. Yeah.
What about things you're sticking to, though?
Things we're sticking to. We're really sticking to trying to keep our own carbon footprint low. So we're doing a lot of riding bikes and catching public transport. We've been offered quite a few cars to borrow and we haven't taken them. And largely that's very doable because we have 2 teenagers who love exercise and are fit and healthy. Might not have worked 10 years ago. So we're doing so that we've stuck to pretty much. Yeah. Yep. We haven't, we've changed our eating habits. A lot of things have changed a lot to fit in with life here. Yeah. Oh, yeah, we don't have a TV. We do have a swimming pool. By accident, sorry.
Thanks, great talk. I was wondering in one of your points there, followed along a train of thought, but it felt that you were pressing against wealth itself as a bad thing, whereas it seems to me that Jesus was saying disordered priorities, love of money, is the root of evil, not necessarily money itself. I'm wondering, as opposed to calling out overconsumption and problems of wealth, how do we encourage a disposition towards generosity? It seems to me that's one of the fundamental issues in our cultural setting here is how do we call people up to something higher rather than how do we form a new policy that imposes upon people to say how do we force the distribution of wealth? How do we encourage generosity?
I think we encourage a lot of things by modelling it. So if you do it, maybe it'll be catching amongst your friends and people who you influence. And I think really believing in it, like the more that we believe that actually this thing that I have isn't the most important thing and it, like hold things lightly and give them away easily. Difficult. I think it's an important question. So I think it's I would also encourage you to think about just how dangerous is money and wealth, though, because while it's not evil in itself, it's pretty insidious. Like it's very difficult to have it and not be attached to it, to have it and not let it determine our lives. I remember one of my bring home lessons from my first ever trip to India was if you don't have carpet, you don't need a vacuum cleaner. Basically, if some things about life are simple, then it simplifies a whole lot more things. And often getting this one more thing just complicates things more. And one of my more recent reflections on that bit where Jesus says, if you've got 2 shirts, give one away, that kind of thing. If someone asks to borrow from you, give and don't expect in return. I think in those things, Jesus wasn't trying to help us solve world poverty. He was trying to teach us how to be generous, basically. It's more for our own benefit that he wants us to give away stuff and not be tight-fisted with it than for the benefit of other people. Sure, they will benefit too, but we tend to do our giving away thinking all about how magnanimous we are and how much it's going to help the other person. If we can give it away and enjoy the benefit of that ourselves, like feel free of that responsibility because, great, I didn't need that, I gave it away, someone else needed it more. What a great solution. I don't know if that helps at all. There's some random thoughts. Yep.
Cathy, if I can just make a comment on the last person's I think our biggest issue is fear. And if we look at what beholds us to this economy is that we're constantly throwing doses of fear to be able to detract from a generous position. So it's the fear of the refugee, it's the fear of our own financial security. And so if we look at the formula that's been given, the young man who comes to Jesus and says, well, what do I do to get eternal life? Now, I'd rather look at that as a metaphor for how do I get happiness, rather than sort of necessarily belonging to a Christian perspective of that. But the metaphor is, well, have a disposition where you just give things away. You can't do that unless you're able to release yourself from that fear and sense of security. So I think that's our challenge. And it's a challenge particularly for our kids. And I wonder how you operate with two children, in the sense that one of the areas where we're most sensitive is that fear that our kids won't be okay. We can perhaps adopt that approach with regard to ourselves and deal with what might happen. But it's another issue to sort of say, well, look, okay, it's not going to be important for my children to have this sort of education, or I'm going to forego this. But kids are also in this culture. And I guess what I'm sort of getting towards here is this question to you: how do you deal with that? Where you're a mother, your parents, and you adopt a particular position, and how do you sort of develop that sense of generosity that enables you to I guess our hope is that our children will have that sense of generosity.
Okay. So in short form, what you're saying is that the part of the difficulty in engendering generosity is that we have all this fear, and the government and the people who are pushing a certain system of world are trying to keep up the fear, because that sort of keeps us under control, keeps us wanting to have more money and build up our retirement and whatever. So then the question that comes out of all that, so I agree, we have really noticed that there's been, particularly a few elections ago, it seemed like the whole election was run on fear-mongering. It's like, we're really going to do security, we're going to protect you Australians and all this kind of things. Like, gosh, what are they really trying to make people scared about here? So I think there is a lot of fear out there in general, and lots of, in some ways, good reasons for fear, but how we deal with it maybe shouldn't be earn more money and keep it in the bank. So how we deal with that personally with our kids, it's been very interesting, because when Tom was first born, we both were a bit fearful about it, partly fearful actually for Tom's well-being in the environment we were living, but probably more fearful of all the criticism we were about to cop for having him in that environment. And in that stage, we were thinking, we don't know how long we'll be here for. We'll probably go back to Australia in a few years. We don't know. And we were feeling like it was a sacrifice to be living there, and that he was missing out on some opportunities and maybe put into more dangers. So we thought it was really important to get discipline right, because there's all sorts of holes you can literally fall down, and unroofed, unfenced roofs in India you can fall off of. There was all sorts of dangers, and we thought that having a disciplined kid who will do what he's told is really important safety measure. And some other things. But as time went on, we came to see more and more that actually growing up in a slum has been a fantastic environment for our kids. And we would like to go back so that Oscar is not robbed of the opportunity to be, for other reasons too, but so that he can be a teenager there, away from all the consumerism and pressure of life here, where he can see more like the real picture for the rest of the world and have that as part of his formative experience as a teenager. So our own attitudes changed a lot over the years about what are we sacrificing and what are we gaining, kind of shifted along that spectrum over a number of years. We also noticed, in terms of worries about our kids, if we ever went to a speaking engagement where we're talking about we do this and we live in the slum and whatever, people would always ask questions about our kids. If we took our kids along, they would think, wow, what healthy, intelligent, normal, well-adjusted kids. And the question wouldn't come up. It was quite amazing. So I recognise that it hasn't been the same for everybody else, but our kids have thrived on what we've done, and both feel very thankful for the childhood that they've had. And haven't suffered great dangers. But we still suffer from fear at times.
Sorry, Matt, we're actually going work
Okay,
to
yeah.
a close
Thank you.
tonight, but I'm sure Cathy would be happy to answer some questions
Yeah.
in person. Can we just once again thank you?